and welcome to Unit 5. Now, don't be misled by the title. Today, we're going to devote a lot of time to the research gap, but we will also talk about other formal elements of the literature review. And actually, tomorrow, you will be doing something very similar as well. Okay? Now, why is this so important? Why is the literature review so important? It is the gateway to your research. When people start reading your dissertation, they will know what the spirit of the work you're doing is, and they will know who you are and how prepared you are by reading your review. And chances are, again, that this is the worst part for you to write, the part that makes you feel more insecure, because you will need to check many sources, and then you will need to make sense of them without plagiarizing, without oversimplifying. So there's a delicate balance. So one of the goals of the course is that you can do the literature review as comfortably as possible. Okay, this is one of our main goals. And one of the most important parts of the literature review is the research gap, okay? So your research gap is something that you need to spot, to identify before you actually start your research. Since you can get into a PhD program through two different modalities, let's say. One is if you're studying at the university, if you're studying in a place and your teachers know you and you want to pursue extra studies, you want to do a master's, for example, it is quite possible that if your teachers see promise in you and you're committed to an academic career, they will accompany you towards your PhD. Okay, so in that case, the research gap may be your supervisor's choice. Maybe they have already identified a gap. And why can they do that? Because they know the literature, they are very updated in the research and innovation done in their field because that's their life, you know? So what they do basically is an inquiry guidance. They take you by the hand and they tell you what it is that you should study. And in many cases, they even suggest the sort of source, that you should be reading, okay? So they may not tell you exactly what papers you have to read, but they will point you towards journals, for example, in your area that are important, or they may mention authors, or they may even talk to you about publications, papers, reports, even articles, you know, that you might want to read. So when that happens, it is actually a bit more difficult to identify the gap because it's been done for you. And what you would need to do is try and understand, make sense of what you were guided towards, you see? Now, if you did your own proposal, okay, which is the other way to get into a PhD, if you write your own proposal for a potential supervisor to take you on and to help you with your thesis, it is quite possible that for your proposal, you had to actually identify a gap. So it's going to be maybe, hopefully, easier for you to identify the gap now. Okay? So regardless of the way you got here, you got to your PhD, it is extremely important that you identify and you can justify your research gap, because this will show your audience, and obviously it will help yourself know where you're going with your research, okay? But so far I've been describing things about the gap, but I haven't defined it, okay? So let's say that a research gap is an area in your field of studies that requires new exploration or a different kind of exploration, and in many, many cases, further exploration. So, what you identify is something that doesn't exist and it's new, and this is really, really difficult at this level. You might do it later on, as if you belong in a team, as part of the team, you might discover something new, but it is pretty difficult. What you might be able to do quite well is to identify a method that may be applied to explore an element in your area a lot better. And in many, many cases, what you will do is extend this method to try and examine or experiment with other things, and that would be the further exploration. There are other possibilities, okay? But if you understand these three, you're going to be quite well, because it's going to help you identify your gap, okay? Now, the way to identify the gap is by becoming familiar with the research that has already been done. Obviously, to do this, what you need to do is read, because research done is made public by writing about it. So the first thing that you will need to do is read and understand the state of the art. And at some point, the gap will be apparent. You will spot a gap. You will say, oh my God, there's a need for extra work here. And that's where you plant your flag. And the reason you plant your flag is that the place where you planted your flag is your research gap. You see? So this is the process. And it is a bit of a eureka moment, you know? I mean, you go, oh my God, this is exactly what I need to do. Now, what's great about defining your gap properly is by defining your gap, your research question will become transparent, which means by identifying your gap, the problem is clear and the problem becomes a research question that you're going to exploit throughout the whole work. Okay? And again, what's cool about having the research question answered is, or discovered, is that this research question will clearly take you to the formulation of the objectives. Your objectives are extremely important because they show the reader the way you feel. I'm thinking of the document, okay, of the dissertation, but actually when you set up an objective, what you're doing is committing to a way to fill the research gap. You see, so it's pretty cool. Yeah? Okay, there you go. So to give you an example of how this works, I'm going to do a very silly thing. Let's think of a very stupid example that will help us understand how this goes, okay? So I know that a joke is a story that has a punchline. And the punchline makes people laugh. So you have a joke, and within the joke there is a structure that will make people laugh. This structure is super important. It's the last part of the last line of the joke, and this is what will somewhat reverse the story and elicit a reaction from people. So what would happen, I wonder, if suddenly I had a joke with no punchline? What would that be? Okay, so the second I ask this question, I have a research gap. I have no idea what would happen. So I set off to start doing my research. Okay, so now you have this very silly sort of picture. Perhaps you can take a couple of minutes and think about the possible research question that you could draw from this particular gap. Can you think about that? Take a minute and produce a statement or a question that would express that. Okay, so you may have a different question that would work very nicely too, but this is mine. Okay, I decided to formulate my question this way. What is the effect of jokes with no punchline? What's the effect they have on people? Okay? So this is my research question, and it's a very, very clear one. Now, remember what I told you. Once you have your research question and it's clear, it is pretty easy to set up the goal. Yes? Can you do that? We're going to do the same. You're going to take a few minutes off and stopping the video, you're going to try and write an objective, a research aim based on this question. Okay, so this is what I did. It helps a lot to think of the goal by writing or thinking of this statement. The goal of this research is to identify the effect of jokes with no punchline. I could change that verb, okay? So in this particular case, I went for the easiest thing. I want to identify the effect of jokes with no punchline. But it could also be, I want to explore the effect of jokes with no punchline. Now, the type of research I would do in this case and in this case would be different. And it would be even more different if I described the effect. You see? So by changing the sort of verb that I'm adding there, I am also defining a different kind of research, a different approach to this research. Look, I am going to observe the effect of jokes with no punchline. So can you imagine? I mean, if I observe it, I will just sit and see how people react and write things down, and I would probably video them so I could look at them later and see their reactions, maybe physical, maybe things they might say or actions they might perform. But imagine if I say I want to analyze the effect of jokes with no punchline. So here my commitment is even greater because probably after observing everything, I will try to make sense of what I see. You see? So what this means is verb choice will declare, will state how I will fill the gap. You see? And that's why this step is really, really important. Now, in many, many cases, when you write a dissertation, you're asked to identify the gap, which is absolutely necessary. And there are some people who just state their research question and that's it. There are some people who state a research question and objectives or only objectives, and there are other people who have to add hypotheses, okay? They are not always necessary, but they will be there. So, this will depend not only on your supervisor or on your own decisions, it will depend also on the requirements that your faculty will have for dissertations, okay? So think that it might be a good idea to think of a hypothesis for your work just to play it safe. And maybe you won't have to use it, but it's good to know how you're going to get there, okay? So a hypothesis is usually a statement, okay? And this statement establishes, says, expresses the expected outcome of your research, okay? So remember our silly, very silly idea about jokes without a punchline? Can you think of a hypothesis for that? I'm going to give you some time. Try to imagine a statement that would express what you expect will happen if people are exposed to jokes with no punchline. Now, write it down. Okay, so here's mine. Jokes with no punchline do not make people laugh. Because that's what I think will happen. I could also do the opposite and say, okay, jokes with no punchline make people laugh, and then my goal will be to prove this hypothesis wrong, to disprove this hypothesis. That's how you say it, okay? So remember, though, that this one I like particularly because hypotheses are usually positive statements. They tend not to be negative for stylistic reasons, and because remember that research is a tradition, okay? I am sure you remember the video you watched on the scientific conversation. This is a very powerful idea. You are doing something that is huge in order to become members of a club. And when you become members of the club, you will produce outcomes that will be part of the conversation that makes up science and scientific discovery. And within that huge panorama, you will be participating in a conversation within your own field. Okay? So this is very important. This is essential. You need to understand that what you're doing with your research is contributing to this dialogue, to this sort of narrative that started a long time ago, and it continues today, and it will go on in the future. And that's why the language that you're expected to produce and the dissertation have to comply with certain formal requirements that are expected from it. It's part of this dialogue. Okay, so I'm mentioning this because you will need to introduce your objectives, at least your objectives. I told you that sometimes there are things that are your choice, okay, but usually objectives have to be introduced. Maybe the hypothesis will need to be introduced, or hypothesis will need to be introduced. So what you need to remember is formally they will look as separate statements. They are not one part of a paragraph. They are separated from the rest of the paragraph that introduces them, and usually you will have like bullet points or maybe numbers identifying them and setting them apart so people know exactly what it is that you're looking for. And believe me, your examiners will mark that page and they will go back to it back and forth several times along their reading of your dissertation. So this is a crucial feature. And the way to do it properly is by identifying this silly research gap. I know I've been repeating this a lot, and that's why it feels so silly, but it is crucial that you identify your research gap properly so the formulation of your objectives, hypothesis, research questions is adequate. So there you go. Today it's